Abel Carver measured his days by the silence between them. 13 years since Mary died, 13 years of dawn coffee on a porch that faced away from town, deliberately. The morning sun cast long shadows across his Texas ranch, catching on the dented tin cup in his weathered hands. The scream came thin on the wind, human, female, desperate. Abel set his cup down slowly, deliberate in this as in all things. Following the sound led him to the creek bend, where she lay curled against stone, stripped of clothing and dignity alike. Her eyes, when they found his, held no tears, only the hollow resignation of one who had seen the worst of humanity and expected no better. Abel removed his coat and turned his back. "Cabin's just beyond that rise when you're ready, ma'am." Some choices defined a man. This one would define them both. In the harsh landscape of 1878 Texas, dignity is sometimes all that remains when everything else is stripped away. What would you do if faced with Abel's choice? Risk your hard-won isolation to protect a stranger, or turn away from someone else's trouble? Share your thoughts below on what true strength looks like in moments that test our humanity. If you believe some stands are worth taking regardless of the cost, follow for the next chapter in this story of quiet courage and unexpected healing. Abel Carver woke before the sun, same as he had every day since the war ended. 13 years of routine had worn smooth paths through his life. Coffee at dawn, livestock at first light, fence work until midday. The small ranch in Lampasas County demanded no conversation, asked no questions about the past, required nothing but labor and vigilance. He built the morning fire with practiced movements, each piece of kindling placed with the economy of a man who wasted nothing, not wood, not words, not emotion. The cabin remained much as his wife had left it, though dust had claimed her touch from every surface save the small chest where he kept her things. Coffee bubbled in the blackened pot. Abel poured the steaming liquid into a dented tin cup, carried it to the porch, and settled into the chair that faced away from town. The April sun crept above the eastern ridge, painting long shadows across his land. Good weather for mending the fence line along the creek where winter floods had loosened posts. His fingers brushed unconsciously against the scar on his thigh, a remnant of Shiloh that ached when rain threatened. Not today. Today would be clear and empty, like all the days he'd built since Mary died of the fever while he was away scouting for the Union. Abel finished his coffee, rinsed the cup at the pump, and saddled his horse with the silent efficiency that defined his existence. The land stretched before him, 40 acres of Texas hardscrabble that asked nothing of him but sweat and persistence. Both he had in abundance. The sound came faint at first, not cattle, not coyote, but human. A cry carried on the wind from the direction of the creek bend. Abel stilled, listening. The sound came again, weaker now, a voice at the edge of surrender. Abel approached the creek bend with his hand on his rifle, wary of what awaited. The water ran clear over smooth stones. Winter's fury long subsided to spring's gentler flow. At first, he saw nothing unusual, just the familiar landscape of his boundary. Then movement caught his eye. Against the trunk of a cottonwood, partially hidden by shadow, lay a woman. As Abel drew closer, his jaw tightened at what he found. She had been stripped of clothing, her dignity torn away like the garments missing from her body. Bruises marked her arms where hands had gripped too tightly. Her feet were scratched and bleeding from walking barefoot across rough terrain. She did not look up at his approach, but he saw her body tense, preparing for further torment. Abel averted his eyes, the gesture instinctive and immediate. War had shown him the depths of human cruelty, but this deliberate humiliation stirred a cold anger he hadn't felt in years. He removed his coat, the faded blue cavalry jacket he still wore, despite the memories it carried, and took a step backward. "Ma'am," he said, the word emerging rough from a throat that formed few words these days. "I'm going to leave this coat here. I'll turn away. My cabin's just beyond that rise when you're ready." He placed the coat on a rock within her reach and turned his back, giving her the choice to take it or not, to follow or not. The decision would be hers alone. After what had been done to her, choice might be the only dignity he could offer. Abel walked to his horse, mounted, and rode slowly back toward his cabin, not looking behind him once. The morning's emptiness had been filled with unwelcome complication, but some lines could not be crossed, some cruelties not ignored, even by a man who had built his life around silence. She appeared at his door an hour later, coat clutched around her like armor. Abel had used the time to prepare, clearing the small second room that had stood empty since he'd built the cabin. He'd placed some of Mary's things, a dress, undergarments, a brush, outside the door, then retreated to give this stranger space to reclaim whatever composure she could. Standing in his doorway now, she looked both fragile and fierce. Dirt streaked her face, but her eyes held a steady watchfulness that recognized his power to harm, yet judged him unlikely to use it. Abel gestured toward the interior without stepping closer. "Spare room's yours," he said, pointing to the door. "Left some of my late wife's things. Should fit well enough." He paused, uncomfortable with so many words at once. "I don't ask questions that aren't offered answers." She nodded once, a barely perceptible movement, then stepped inside. Abel closed the front door behind her, then moved to the porch to give her space. He heard the careful opening and closing of the bedroom door, then silence. Abel retrieved another cup, Mary's cup, unused for 13 years, and poured fresh coffee. He set it on the table beside a plate of cornbread and salt pork, then returned to the porch. The meal was simple hospitality, nothing more, but it was all he knew to offer. Through the window, he watched her eventually emerge from the bedroom. Mary's dress hung loose on her thinner frame, but she wore it with a dignity that transcended circumstance. She approached the table cautiously, eyed the food, then sat to eat with slow, deliberate movements. As twilight gathered, Abel heard the distant rhythm of approaching horses. He checked his rifle and waited. Who would come this far from town, and what did they want with a woman they'd already tried to destroy? Abel hadn't been to town in 3 weeks. Judging by how conversation died when he entered Wheeler's general store, that had been too soon for some folks' comfort. The bell above the door jangled an unwelcome announcement of his arrival, drawing the eyes of 4 men gathered near the pot-bellied stove. Their gazes lingered, then deliberately turned away. Sarah Wheeler set aside the inventory ledger she'd been updating and approached the counter. At 40, she carried herself with the quiet authority of a woman who'd buried 1 husband and raised 2 children on her own. Her store was the lifeblood of trade for 20 miles. "Morning, Abel," she said, neither warm nor cold, just business. "What can I get you?" "Flour, coffee." He placed a basket of eggs on the counter. And some fabric, plain cotton." Sarah's eyebrow raised slightly at the last item, but she nodded and began collecting his supplies. The men by the stove had resumed their conversation, voices pitched just loud enough for Abel to hear. "Hear the Holt widow ran off. Crazy as her mother, they say." The speaker was Ellis Jackson, a man who owned more cattle than sense. Jeremiah claims she stole family heirlooms. Reward for anyone who spots her. This from Tom Billings, who'd never been known to refuse money regardless of the work required. Abel kept his face impassive as he counted out coins for his purchase. Sarah leaned forward, voice dropping. "Folks are watching what you carry out of here today, Abel." He nodded once, understanding. Small towns survived on talk. Someone had seen something, perhaps the woman walking toward his ranch, perhaps his coat around her shoulders. As Abel loaded his supplies, Sheriff Grant watched from the jailhouse porch, his face unreadable beneath his mustache. Neither man acknowledged the other. Sarah locked the front door, flipped the sign to closed, and beckoned Abel to the storeroom. The space smelled of leather, coffee beans, and the faint sweetness of molasses barrels. She struck a match to light a lantern despite the midday hour, the small flame casting shadows across her concerned face. "The Holts were in yesterday," she said without preamble. "Jeremiah and his boys turned this store upside down looking for Lena, that's her name, Walter Holt's widow." Abel arranged his features to reveal nothing. "Not asking for her story. Maybe you should." Sarah folded a woman's dress, chemise, and stockings into plain brown paper. "Jeremiah Holt claims his son died of fever. Truth is, young Walter Holt was meaner drunk than sober. Beat that girl something fierce." She paused, eyes meeting Abel's. "After Walter died, they treated her like property. When she objected to being passed along to the younger brother, her hand gesture completed what words wouldn't." Abel's jaw tightened. "How many Holts?" "Jeremiah and 3 sons. Connected to everyone who matters in the county. Judge Crawford owes them money. Sheriff Grant's sister married the middle boy." She pressed the wrapped clothing into Abel's hands. "When they come, and they will come, don't face them alone." Abel reached into his pocket, but Sarah shook her head. "No charge for these." He left payment anyway, slipping out through the back door where fewer eyes would track his departure. The weight of the wrapped clothing seemed heavier than it should, laden with complications he'd spent 13 years avoiding. Yet as he mounted his horse, Abel found his hand drifting to where his deputy's badge had once been pinned. Some habits died harder than others. Abel returned to find the cabin swept clean, fire stoked, and a pot of something that smelled better than anything he'd managed in years. The woman, Lena, he corrected himself, stood by the stove, stirring with a wooden spoon. She tensed slightly at his entrance, but didn't flee. He placed the bundle on the table. "From Sarah Wheeler. Thought you might need these." "Thank you." Her voice emerged quiet but clear, the first words she'd spoken. 2 simple syllables that somehow eased the awkwardness between them. Abel hung his hat and moved to wash his hands at the basin. He noticed the cabin's subtle transformations: swept floor, organized shelves, his few possessions arranged with care. She had imposed order on his sparse existence without overstepping boundaries. "Smells good," he said, nodding toward the pot. "Stew, not much to work with." A hint of apology colored her words. "More than I'd have done with it." He meant it as appreciation, though the words came out gruff. They ate in silence that gradually shifted from strained to something approaching comfortable. Abel observed her furtively, the careful way she held herself, the deliberate movements that betrayed both caution and determination. Her hands were those of a woman accustomed to work, but educated too, her manners revealing more than she likely intended. When they finished, she gathered the dishes without being asked, establishing her place not as guest, but as contributor. Abel recognized the silent communication, her way of paying for sanctuary, of maintaining dignity. He set his coffee cup down and moved to the window. "Riders coming," he said, his voice unchanged, but his shoulders squaring. "Best you stay out of sight." The dust cloud on the horizon heralded the arrival he'd been expecting since town. The Holts were coming to reclaim what they believed was theirs. 3 riders pulled up short of the cabin. The eldest, gray-bearded with eyes cold as river stones, assessed the property with the gaze of a man already counting what it would bring at auction. His two sons flanked him, younger mirrors of his hard features. Their horses stood restless in the midday heat, sensing the tension. Abel waited on the porch, rifle propped casually against the wall behind him. Close enough to reach, far enough to suggest he wasn't looking for trouble. The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled taut. "You Abel Carver?" The eldest finally spoke, his voice carrying the authoritative tone of a man accustomed to deference. "I am." Abel remained still, offering nothing more. "I'm Jeremiah Holt. These are my boys, Samuel and Ezekiel." He gestured to the men beside him. "We're looking for my daughter-in-law. Trail leads here." Abel studied them, noting how the sons' hands rested near their holsters, how their eyes darted toward the cabin windows. The older one, Samuel, had the heavy-lidded gaze of a man who enjoyed others' discomfort. "This is private property, Mr. Holt." Jeremiah's mouth tightened beneath his beard. "Law says family has rights to retrieve their own. Law says a man's land is his to decide who stays and who doesn't." Abel shifted his weight slightly, maintaining the appearance of calm while positioning himself between the riders and the cabin door. Jeremiah dismounted, crossing the invisible boundary Abel had established with deliberate provocation. "You harboring a thief, Carver? Woman stole family property when she ran. That's a criminal matter." Abel said nothing, merely held the man's gaze with the steady patience of someone who had waited out worse threats than bluster. The cabin door opened. All men turned to see Lena standing in the doorway, wrapped in a proper dress, her face composed despite the whiteness of her knuckles gripping the doorframe. Lena stepped onto the porch, her face betraying nothing of the storm surely raging within. She stood above them, the elevated position granting her small advantage in the confrontation. The dress Sarah had sent fit well enough, modest, proper, a statement of dignity reclaimed. Jeremiah's posture shifted, adopting a paternal air that poorly masked the underlying threat. "Lena, girl, time to come home. Whatever grievances you have, family sorts them privately." Lena remained silent, her gaze unwavering upon her father-in-law. The quiet stretched, uncomfortable for the Holts, who shifted in their saddles. "You're embarrassing yourself and disrespecting Walter's memory," Jeremiah continued, his voice hardening as her silence challenged his authority. Samuel leaned forward in his saddle. "Come now, Lena. I've prepared the room just as you like it." His smile suggested arrangements she'd never agreed to. Ezekiel, the youngest, at least had the decency to look uncomfortable, his eyes fixed on his horse's mane rather than the woman they'd abandoned half-naked by the creek. "She stays if she chooses," Abel said, voice level. "That's all there is to it." Jeremiah's face darkened with anger poorly contained. "This isn't your affair, Carver. The woman's addled, like her mother before her, cannot be trusted to make sound decisions." "Seems clear-minded to me," Abel replied. Lena stepped forward, deliberately moving closer to Abel, a choice made visible for all to witness. Still she said nothing, but her position spoke volumes. Jeremiah's hand clenched on his saddle horn. "This isn't over, Carver. Not by a long measure." The three men remounted, Jeremiah's control over his sons reasserted with sharp gestures. As they rode away, he called back, "We'll return with the Sheriff, Carver. Law's on our side in this." Abel waited until dust settled before turning to Lena. "Reckon we should prepare for that." After the Holts left, Lena stood staring at the bare patch of earth beside the cabin, seeing something Abel couldn't. The afternoon sun illuminated the determination in her face as she surveyed the unpromising ground. Her fingers worked the soil, testing its composition with the knowledge of someone who understood growing things. "Do you have seeds?" Her question broke the silence between them. Vegetable seeds? Abel looked up from checking his rifle, surprised by this unexpected turn. Some. In the storage shed. From last year. Could I? She hesitated, the request clearly important to her. Would it be all right if I planted a garden? Here? Abel considered the hardscrabble plot she'd indicated. Land's not good for much. Clay soil. My mother grew vegetables in worse. A small smile flickered across her face, the first he'd seen. I know how to make things grow. They walked together to the shed where Abel kept tools and supplies. The space was organized with military precision, everything in its place. He located a tin box containing seed packets, beans, squash, tomatoes, preserved from the previous season. Not much, he said, handing her the box. Never had the touch for growing. Lena examined the seeds with careful fingers, assessing their viability. These will do to start, might need more later. Abel found himself nodding, the words implying a future neither had acknowledged before. He located a spare spade and hoe, handles worn smooth from his wife's hands years ago. Lena took them with reverence, understanding their significance without being told. By sunset, she had marked the boundaries of her garden with stones gathered from the creek. Small furrows appeared in the soil, the beginning of order imposed on wilderness. Abel watched from a distance, recognizing the act for what it was, not just gardening, but putting down roots. As darkness fell, they heard a single horse approaching. Sheriff, Abel said, recognizing the plodding gait of Grant's gelding. Lena's hands stilled in the dirt, but she didn't run inside, another small victory claimed. Sheriff William Grant removed his hat as he approached, a gesture of respect that contradicted the official papers folded in his breast pocket. At 51, Grant carried the weariness of a man who'd compromised too often with powers greater than his badge. His mustache drooped at the corners, matching the downward turn of his mouth. "Evening, Carver, ma'am." He nodded to both, standing awkwardly beside his horse rather than dismounting fully. "Sheriff." Abel acknowledged, neither friendly nor hostile. Grant cleared his throat. "Had a visit from Jeremiah Holt today. He's filing official papers claiming his daughter-in-law is unwell, seeking guardianship. She seems perfectly well to me." Abel's tone remained even, though his posture had subtly shifted to alertness. The sheriff glanced at Lena, who stood with soil-stained hands, an unwavering gaze. He looked away first. "Abel," Grant lowered his voice, though not enough to prevent Lena from hearing. "The judge owes Holt money. This won't go your way in court." "Do I have any say in this matter, Sheriff?" Lena's voice cut through the evening air, clear and controlled. Grant shifted uncomfortably, fingers working the brim of his hat. "Ma'am, legally speaking, not much. Widows fall under the protection of their husband's family unless they remarry or have means of their own." "And if I have employment?" Lena asked. "If I am not dependent on charity?" The sheriff blinked, considering. Might help, but Holt's influence runs deep. "When's the hearing?" Abel asked. "Friday, Judge Crawford's court." Grant remounted his horse. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry about this business. Some things ain't right, law or no." After the sheriff rode away, Abel turned to Lena. "Know anyone who might help? Family? Friends?" Lena's eyes hardened. "There's no one, just us." The word us hung in the air between them, the first alliance either had formed in years. Sheriff Grant returned at dawn, this time with official papers bearing the county seal. The morning light did nothing to soften the resignation in his eyes as he handed the documents to Abel. Lena stood in the doorway, her face composed despite the pallor beneath her sun-touched skin. Court hearings set for Friday. Judge Crawford will hear the petition for guardianship, Grant explained, shifting his weight uncomfortably. 10 o'clock at the courthouse. Abel unfolded the papers, scanning the formal language with a furrowed brow. On what grounds? Abandonment of marital home, mental instability, theft of family property. The sheriff recited the claims without conviction. Pretty standard for these cases. I took nothing but my mother's locket, Lena said, her voice quietly furious. Her fingers unconsciously touched the small pendant at her throat, the one possession she'd managed to keep. The sheriff had the decency to look embarrassed. You'll need to appear, ma'am. If you don't, judgment goes to the Holts automatically. Abel folded the papers carefully, his movements deliberate. And if we fight it? Then you'd best have something stronger than just your word against Jeremiah Holts. Grant replaced his hat, preparing to leave. Judge Crawford owes Holt for financing his last campaign, and Samuel Holt's got 3 witnesses ready to testify to Mrs. Holt's episodes. Fabrications, Lena said, the word sharp as a knife. Maybe so, ma'am, the sheriff nodded. But sworn testimony carries weight. After the sheriff left, Abel reached for his hat. I know someone who might help. Man who knows the law as it's written and as it's practiced. Lena nodded. I'll come with you. Not a question this time, but a declaration of intent. Abel recognized the shift, from sheltering to partnership, and accepted it with a nod. Thomas Reyes didn't stop hammering as they approached his forge, but his eyes tracked their arrival with careful assessment. The blacksmith shop stood at the edge of town, its location a reflection of both practical necessity and the community's unspoken boundaries. At 44, Tomas carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had survived the shifting tides of border politics with wit sharper than the blades he crafted. Been a while, Tomas, Abel said, dismounting and tying his horse. Tomas plunged the glowing metal into water, sending steam hissing upward. 3 years, 2 months, since you hung up your badge. He nodded to Lena. Senora, welcome. The formality in his address carried respect, often denied to women in her position. Lena straightened slightly, recognizing an ally. Need your help? Abel said. Legal matter. Thomas set aside his tools, wiping hands on his leather apron. The Holts, already heard. He gestured them toward a small room behind the main forge, where ledgers and books lined rough wooden shelves. You were married to Walter Holt? He asked Lena directly. Yes. And now his father claims you as property. Tomas's expression darkened as he examined the court summons Abel handed him. His eyes, educated beyond what most expected from a blacksmith, moved methodically through the legal language. After a moment, he looked up. There might be a way. Not as wife, but as contracted employee, you have different rights. He took a sheet of paper, writing in a hand that betrayed formal schooling. Employment contract, dated before the court filing, states you've been hired as housekeeper and gardener. Sets terms, payment, lodging. His pen moved with practiced precision. Makes you a free woman employed by Mr. Carver rather than a ward to be claimed. Will it work? Abel asked. Maybe. It gives the judge an alternative if he wants to save face while defying Holt. The road to town stretched before them, each hoofbeat bringing Lena closer to facing the Holts with the entire community as witness. Abel drove the wagon steadily, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon from long habit. Beside him, Lena sat with the employment contract secured in her pocket, rehearsing what she would say. Judge Crawford will try to talk over you, Abel advised, breaking their companionable silence. Don't let him. I taught school before I married Walter, Lena replied, a revelation that clearly surprised him. I know how to make myself heard." Abel glanced at her with new appreciation. "Didn't know you were a teacher." "There's a lot about me the Holts tried to bury." Determination hardened her features. "But I remember who I was before Walter Holt decided to make me his wife." As they approached town, the road became more traveled. Farmers and ranchers nodded to Abel, their curious gazes lingering on Lena. News traveled fast in small communities, and their appearance together confirmed the whispered rumors. They stopped briefly at Wheeler's general store, where Sarah pressed a shawl into Lena's hands. "For the courthouse," she whispered. "Appearances matter with Judge Crawford." Her eyes held unspoken understanding. One woman who had navigated difficult circumstances, recognizing another's struggle. The courthouse stood at the center of town, its whitewashed wood already yellowing under the Texas sun. 3 horses tied at the hitching post bore the Holt brand on their saddles. They paused at the steps, the weight of what awaited heavy between them. Inside were the Holts, the judge, and most of the town's gossips, all gathered to witness the spectacle of a woman fighting for her own freedom. Abel offered his arm. "Ready?" Lena straightened her borrowed dress, chin lifted. "I've been ready since the day they left me by your creek." The courthouse fell silent as Lena walked down the center aisle, her eyes never leaving Judge Crawford's bench. The room was packed. Townspeople crowded the back wall, while the front rows held the Holt family and their supporters. Jeremiah sat with an air of absolute certainty, his sons flanking him like sentries. Judge Crawford, a florid man whose judicial dignity was undermined by the sweat staining his collar, called the proceeding to order with 3 sharp raps of his gavel. Petition for guardianship of Mrs. Lena Holt, filed by Jeremiah Holt, father-in-law of the respondent. He peered at Lena over spectacles perched on his nose. "Mrs. Holt, your father-in-law has petitioned for guardianship, claiming you're unable to manage your affairs." Lena's voice carried clearly through the room. "I am quite capable, Your Honor, as evidenced by my employment contract with Mr. Carver." She presented the document Tomas had prepared. The judge examined it with growing frustration as Jeremiah Holt rose to his feet. "Ridiculous! Some hastily arranged—" "Mr. Holt, you'll have your turn," the judge interrupted, though his tone suggested sympathy with the interruption. Lena stood her ground. "After my husband died, the Holts claimed everything, including me. When I refused to marry Samuel as they'd arranged, they took my clothes, my dignity, and left me to die of exposure." Murmurs swept through the courthouse. Several women exchanged glances, while men shifted uncomfortably. "She's lying," Jeremiah thundered. "She's always been unstable, just like her mother. I am employed by Mr. Carver as housekeeper and gardener," Lena continued steadily. "I am not property to be claimed." The judge studied the contract again, clearly searching for a procedural flaw. Finding none, he reluctantly decreed, "This matter requires further review. The court will reconvene in 1 month. Until then, the respondent may continue her employment arrangement." As they exited the courthouse, temporary victory in hand, Jeremiah grabbed Abel's arm. His whisper carried only to Abel's ear. "You'll wish you'd died with your wife before this is over, Carver." The smell of smoke woke Abel, not wood smoke from the hearth, but the acrid stench of coal oil and burning hay. He bolted upright in darkness, mind instantly alert with the awareness that comes from years of vigilance. Through the window, an orange glow illuminated the night sky where his barn stood. "Fire!" Abel shouted, already pulling on his boots. He grabbed his rifle by habit before rushing outside, where the full horror awaited him. The barn was engulfed in flames that reached hungrily toward the night sky. Inside, his horses whinnied in panic, their shadows visible through gaps in the burning planks. The cattle in the nearby pen bellowed and pushed against the fencing, eyes wild with fear. Lena appeared beside him, her face pale in the firelight. "The animals! Get the buckets! Pumps by the well!" Abel shouted before running toward the barn. The heat pushed against him like a physical force as he approached the main doors. Inside, the horses kicked desperately at their stalls. Abel pulled his coat over his head and plunged into the inferno. Smoke seared his lungs as he fought to reach the first stall. The mare inside reared in panic, but Abel grabbed her halter, forcing her toward the door with the weight of his body. Once outside, he slapped her flank to send her clear of the flames before diving back into the hell of smoke and fire. Lena had organized a bucket line from the well, but they both knew it was futile. This fire had been set with purpose, coal oil splashed liberally to ensure destruction. Still, she worked methodically, passing bucket after bucket with grim determination. By dawn, the barn was nothing but smoking timbers and ash. 2 horses saved, 1 lost to the flames. Half his winter hay gone, tools destroyed, wagon damaged beyond easy repair. Abel surveyed the ruins, with eyes reddened by smoke, his face streaked with soot and sweat. "This was them, the Holts," Lena said, her voice hoarse. Abel nodded, too exhausted for words. The attack carried Jeremiah Holt's signature, a warning that legal battles weren't the only weapons at his disposal. "Could have been worse," Abel finally said, squinting at the rising sun. "Could have been the house while we slept." As they stood amid the destruction, the full impact of what had happened sank in. This wasn't just property damage. It was Abel's livelihood, his independence. Without the barn, without proper tools and shelter for animals, the ranch would struggle to survive until winter. Lena found Abel's packed saddlebags before he could hide them. Her face went still as stone when she saw them on the bed, the rifle leaning against the wall beside them. The implications were clear enough. He was preparing to leave. Whether to confront the Holts or simply flee, she couldn't tell. "You're leaving." Her voice was flat, carefully emptied of emotion. Abel turned, surprised to find her in the doorway. He hadn't heard her approach. "Going to end this, my way, with violence. Not a question, but an assessment." "With whatever works." His jaw was set in a hard line that reminded her of the determined scout who'd once worn a uniform, who'd once believed in justice delivered at the end of a rifle. Lena entered the room, her movements careful as she approached the window. Outside, the scorched earth where the barn had stood was still smoking in places, a monument to Holt vindictiveness. "I should be the one to go. This is my fight that's cost you everything." "This was my choice," Abel said, the words emerging roughly. He continued packing, ammunition, a small bag of coffee, jerky wrapped in cloth. Lena turned to face him, her composure cracking. "So you'll become a killer again? Like in the war?" Abel's hands stilled, his expression shifting to surprise. "How did you—" "Sarah told me," Lena admitted, "about the scout who became sheriff's deputy, who gave it up after killing a man." The silence stretched between them like a widening chasm. Abel's face hardened again, shuttering whatever vulnerability had briefly appeared. That was a different life. Lena began gathering her few possessions, the dress Sarah had given her, her mother's locket, the small knife she kept for protection. Her movements were deliberate, mirroring his preparations. "Then I'll go back to town. Sarah will take me in until I can find passage elsewhere. The Holts will be watching for that. Better than seeing you destroyed because of me." Her voice finally broke on the last word, the emotion she'd been containing spilling through the cracks of her careful control. They moved in opposite directions, the cabin suddenly too small for the weight of their unspoken fears. His that caring would lead to loss again, hers that she had brought only destruction to the one person who had shown her kindness. Abel's hand was on the door when he heard the sound of breaking china. He turned to see Lena standing frozen, staring down at the pieces of a teacup that had been sitting on the sideboard, the last intact piece from the set that had belonged to Mary Carver. The teacup lay in fragments on the floor, white porcelain scattered like broken promises. Lena knelt immediately, gathering the pieces with trembling hands, tears falling silently onto the fragments. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "It was your wife's." Abel stood motionless for a long moment before setting down his saddlebags. He knelt beside her, his rough hands joining hers in collecting the delicate shards. Just a cup. But they both knew it was more than that. It was the last tangible piece of the life he'd lost, of the woman he'd failed to save, of the connection to humanity he'd severed when he built his walls of silence. Lena carried the broken pieces to the table, arranging them carefully. From a shelf, she retrieved a small pot of glue used for mending harnesses. With methodical precision, she began reassembling the cup, piece by fragile piece. "Things that break can be mended," she said, focusing intently on her work. "Not the same, but sometimes stronger." Abel watched her hands work their patient magic, the cup gradually taking shape again under her care. The silence between them shifted from tension to something quieter, a shared understanding forming without words. "I'm not leaving to kill them," Abel finally said. "Going to get legal papers from the county seat. Property deed in both our names." Lena's hands stilled, her eyes lifting to meet his. "Both our names?" "Partnership agreement. Legal protection. If something happens to me, ranch is yours, clear and documented." He spoke matter-of-factly, but the implications of such an arrangement hung in the air between them, a commitment neither had been willing to voice before. "Why would you do that?" she asked, unable to hide her astonishment. Abel studied the partially mended cup, choosing his words carefully. "Been alone too long. Walls don't just keep people out, they keep you in." He met her gaze directly. "Lost one life already. Don't aim to lose another by running." Lena's expression softened, understanding the cost of such an admission from this solitary man. "I won't let you face them alone. Not anymore." Together, they finished mending the cup, their fingers occasionally brushing as they worked. The result was imperfect, fine lines marking where breaks had been, the handle slightly askew, but it held together, stronger at its broken places. As twilight gathered, they sat at the table drinking coffee from the mended cup, passing it between them in a ritual that felt strangely intimate. The partnership agreement lay between them, names joined in ink as their lives had become joined through circumstance and choice. The sound of an approaching horse broke their reverie. Abel rose and checked his rifle, peering through the window at the solitary rider coming slow along the trail. "It's Jacob Holt," he said, recognizing the youngest son, riding alone. "A trap?" Lena asked, already moving toward the rifle, leaning against the wall. Abel watched the rider's careful approach, hands conspicuously empty of weapons. "Maybe not. He's coming in open, no sign of others." They exchanged a glance of mutual understanding. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Two broken people finding strength in their mending. Abel met Jacob Holt at the edge of the yard, rifle held loose but ready. "That's far enough, boy." The youngest Holt son reined his horse to a stop, hands raised to shoulder height, to display his peaceful intentions. At 26, Jacob lacked the hardened edge of his father and brothers. His face showed strain, dark circles under his eyes, stubble on his usually clean-shaven jaw. "I came alone." "Unarmed," he called, keeping his distance respectfully. "Need to talk to you and Mrs. Holt." Abel studied him, weighing possibility against risk. "Dismount. Slow. Leave your gun belt on the saddle." Jacob complied, movements deliberate to avoid misunderstanding. Once on the ground, he turned his pockets inside out, an old cavalry trick showing he carried no hidden weapons. The gesture wasn't lost on Abel, who recognized it from his scouting days. "State your business," Abel said as Jacob approached. "Pa's planning to burn you out completely. Tomorrow night." Jacob's voice was low, urgent. "Got the sheriff's deputy Morris in his pocket. They're calling it a posse to arrest you for kidnapping, but that's not what they mean to do." Lena appeared on the porch, shotgun in hand. "Why tell us this, Jacob?" Jacob looked at the ground, shame evident in his posture. "What they did to you wasn't right. What they're doing now isn't right." He glanced back toward town, nervousness clear in his movements. "Samuel's been drinking heavy since the courthouse, talking wild. And Pa," he shook his head, "never seen him like this." "Your father won't look kindly on this visit," Abel observed. "I know. Can't go back now." The simple statement carried the weight of a life-changing decision. Abel exchanged a look with Lena, a silent communication passing between them. She nodded slightly, lowering the shotgun. "Come inside," Abel said. "Tell us exactly what they're planning." The cabin felt crowded with 3 people around the small table. Jacob sat with his back to the wall, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that Lena had silently provided. The hospitality seemed to surprise him. 8 men total, Jacob explained. Pa, Samuel, Ezekiel, Deputy Morris, and his cousin from the next county. 3 hired guns from Fort Worth who owe Pa favors. He traced a rough map on the tabletop with his finger. "They'll come from 3 directions after midnight. Plan to surround the place, fire the outbuildings first, drive you out toward the creek where they'll be waiting." Abel listened impassively, but his mind was already calculating angles, positions, vulnerabilities. The ranch was indefensible with just 3 people, even if Jacob could be trusted with a weapon. "We need to ride to town tonight," Abel said, turning to Lena. "Wake the Reverend if necessary. Time to gather whatever allies we can find." "Town's not safe for Mrs. Holt," Jacob warned. "Pa's got men watching Sarah Wheeler's place and the boarding house." "Not going there," Abel replied. "The church. Reverend Collins keeps to himself, but he doesn't bow to Jeremiah Holt or anyone else." Lena nodded in agreement. "Michael Collins has no love for the Holts." Walter once interrupted his sermon, drunk and belligerent. The Reverend never forgot the disrespect. Abel began gathering what they would need: the partnership papers, the employment contract, what little money he had saved. "Jacob, you come with us or stay here?" The young man's face showed conflict. "Can't go back to Pa, can't ride with you into town either. I'd be recognized." "North Pasture has a line shack," Abel offered. "Not much, but it's shelter." "I'll wait there," Jacob decided. "Maybe I can warn you if they move early." The plan settled, they prepared to ride. As they mounted their horses, Abel noticed Lena taking one last look at the garden she'd started. Tiny green shoots just breaking through the soil. The sight hardened his resolve. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about the right to build something new from broken ground. The church stood at the western edge of town, its white clappered walls ghostly in the moonlight. No lamps burned inside, but Abel knew the Reverend often worked late, writing sermons or tending to church accounts. They approached cautiously, using the cemetery's shadows for cover. Abel knocked softly at the back door, the one that led to the Reverend's small adjoining house. Michael Collins answered with a Bible in one hand and a Remington revolver in the other, a man familiar with both salvation and practicality. At 63, his face bore the deep lines of someone who'd witnessed both the best and worst of human nature. "Abel Carver," he said with mild surprise, "and Mrs. Holt, I presume." He lowered the revolver and stepped aside. "Better come in quickly." The Reverend's study was lined with books, theological texts alongside practical manuals on frontier living. A lamp burned low on his desk, illuminating scattered papers. "Trouble with the Holts, I imagine," Collins said, setting aside his Bible, but keeping the revolver within reach. "Half the county's heard about the courthouse incident." "It's gone beyond trouble," Lena explained. "They mean to burn us out tomorrow night, 8 armed men coming to kill us under the pretense of a legal posse." The Reverend's expression darkened. Murder disguised as justice is still murder. He looked to Abel. "What do you need from me?" Abel placed the partnership agreement on the desk. "Witness and notary, making Lena legal co-owner of my ranch. Need it properly documented and filed where the Holts can't destroy it." Collins examined the document with care, his eyes widening slightly at the arrangement. Such a partnership between unmarried individuals was unusual, especially given their brief acquaintance. But the Reverend had spent enough years on the frontier to recognize the practical necessity of such arrangements. "This protects Mrs. Holt's position should anything happen to you," he observed. "But it won't stop Jeremiah Holt's men tomorrow night." "No," Abel agreed, "but it removes their legal pretense, makes it murder plain and simple." The Reverend nodded thoughtfully. "The law may arrive too late to prevent violence, but perhaps not too late for justice afterward." He reached for his notary seal. "I'll witness this, and I'll send copies to the county seat by tomorrow's mail coach. But what of tonight? Where will you go?" "Back to the ranch," Abel said. "Can't leave it undefended." "You need help," Collins stated flatly. "I'm an old man with one revolver, but I can still ride, and I can still bear witness to what happens." Lena touched the Reverend's hand in gratitude. "Witnesses may be all that stands between us and unmarked graves." A knock at the door startled them all. Collins motioned them to silence as he approached the window, peering cautiously through the curtains. His tension eased. "It's Sarah Wheeler," he said, moving to the door. "And unless I'm mistaken, that's Tomas Reyes with her." The small room grew crowded as Sarah and Tomas joined them. Sarah carried a bundle of supplies, food, ammunition, medical supplies, while Tomas brought his own rifle and a determined expression. "Jacob Holt came to my store after dark," Sarah explained. "Told me what his father was planning." She looked to Lena. "That boy always was different from the rest of them." "He's at my line shack," Abel confirmed. "Couldn't go home after warning us." Tomas nodded approvingly. "It takes courage to stand against family, especially one like the Holts." The blacksmith's voice carried the weight of someone who understood difficult choices. "I've sent word to friends in the Mexican quarter. 2 or 3 may join us by morning." Abel felt something unfamiliar expand in his chest, the warmth of community after years of isolation. "Why risk yourselves for us?" "The Holts have ruled through fear too long," Sarah said simply. "Someone needs to take a stand, and it's easier to stand together," Tomas added. The Reverend Collins finished notarizing the partnership agreement with a flourish of his pen. "The law should protect people like Mrs. Holt, but when it fails, Community must fill the breach. He divided the document into copies, securing one in his church safe. We'll ride at first light, together. As they finalized their plans, Eliza Thornton, the elderly postmistress who seemed to know everyone's business, appeared at the door with coffee and information. Deputy Morris was seen buying extra ammunition, she reported without preamble, and the Holt boys are drinking at Wilkins' saloon, talking loud about settling scores. Abel took in this new information with the tactical assessment of his scouting days. They might move earlier than planned. "Then we should return now," Lena said with quiet determination. "I won't be driven from home again." The word home hung in the air, significant in its casual use. The ranch had transformed from refuge to something worth defending, not just property, but the promise of a new beginning. As they prepared to leave, Abel looked at the unlikely allies gathered in the Reverend's study: a shopkeeper, a blacksmith, a postmistress, a preacher, and the woman who had changed everything by surviving. Lines had been drawn, but not the ones Jeremiah Holt expected. They rode out as dawn approached, 6 defenders against 8 attackers. Not favorable odds by normal reckoning, but Abel had fought longer odds before, and this time he wasn't fighting alone. As they crested the rise overlooking the ranch, dust clouds appeared on the horizon, too many riders for just the Holts. The time for preparation had ended. Now came the standing. The riders approached from the east, silhouettes darkening against the rising sun as they crossed Abel's property line. 8 men in formation, Jeremiah Holt at the center, flanked by his sons Samuel and Ezekiel. Deputy Morris rode slightly behind, badge glinting on his chest to provide a veneer of legal authority. 3 strangers completed the group, hard men with the watchful eyes of hired guns. Abel stood on his porch, rifle held casually at his side. Behind him, Lena waited in the doorway while Reverend Collins, Sarah, Thomas, and Eliza positioned themselves visibly around the yard, witnesses to whatever would unfold. Jacob Holt had joined them at dawn, choosing his side in the coming confrontation. "That's far enough," Abel called when the riders reached the halfway point between the property line and the cabin. His voice carried across the morning air, steady and uncompromising. Jeremiah Holt raised his hand, bringing his group to a halt. Surprise flickered across his face at the sight of witnesses, quickly replaced by the practiced confidence of a man accustomed to imposing his will. "You're harboring my daughter-in-law against her will, Carver," he shouted. "Deputy Morris has papers for her return and your arrest." Deputy Morris shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. The presence of Reverend Collins complicated what should have been a simple intimidation operation disguised as law enforcement. "Mrs. Holt is here by choice," Abel replied evenly, "and she's not alone." Jeremiah's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the gathered witnesses. His gaze lingered on Jacob, his youngest son, now standing beside Abel. "Boy, what are you doing?" Jacob straightened his shoulders, though his voice wavered slightly. "What's right, Pa? For once." "The woman belongs with family," Jeremiah insisted, addressing the witnesses now rather than Abel. "This man's taken advantage of her confused state." "I'm not confused," Lena called, stepping forward to stand beside Abel. "And I'm exactly where I choose to be." Samuel Holt spat into the dust. "Woman doesn't know her own mind. Just like her crazy mother." Reverend Collins moved to stand on Abel's other side, his Bible held conspicuously in one hand. "Mrs. Holt appears perfectly sound to me, as does her choice of companions." Jeremiah Holt's face darkened as his carefully constructed narrative began unraveling before witnesses. "This is a family matter, Reverend. Best leave it to those concerned. When you plan to burn a man's home with him inside, it becomes a community concern, Collins replied, voice carrying the moral authority of his position. A sin I cannot overlook. Deputy Morris shifted again, looking to Jeremiah for direction. The plan had changed. Supposed to be a simple intimidation, perhaps a beating for Carver, the woman taken back by force. Not a public confrontation with the town's most respected citizens as witnesses. Abel stepped forward, partnership agreement in hand. Mrs. Holt is legal co-owner of this property as of yesterday, notarized and filed with the territorial court. She's not your daughter-in-law anymore. She's my business partner. Convenient arrangement, Jeremiah sneered. Papers don't change blood. She's still Walter's widow, still family. The law says otherwise, Thomas Reyes added, his educated voice carrying the precision of someone who understood legal matters. A widow with employment and property has no legal obligation to her husband's family. Jeremiah's control slipped further. You bring a Mexican to lecture me on law? On my rights to my own family? I bring the truth, Tomas replied with dignity. Something in short supply when you speak, Senor Holt. The confrontation balanced on a knife's edge. The hired guns watched impassively, waiting for orders. Samuel's hand hovered near his pistol, while Ezekiel looked increasingly uncertain. Only Jacob appeared resolute in his position beside Abel. Enough talk, Jeremiah finally said, gesturing to his men. Morris, serve your papers. Boys, get the woman. Abel raised his rifle slightly, not aiming, but ready. Take one step closer, and I'll consider it trespassing with intent to harm. Legal papers say this land belongs to Lena and me. You're not welcome here. Deputy Morris hesitated, the badge on his chest suddenly feeling heavier than it should. Mr. Holt, I don't think— You're not paid to think, Jeremiah snapped. He turned to Samuel. Get her. Samuel drew his pistol, but before he could advance, Jacob stepped directly into his path. No, Jacob said, voice stronger now. This ends here, Pa. No more forcing people, no more threats, no more midnight fires. Jeremiah's face contorted with fury. You stand against your own blood? For what? Some mad woman and a hermit? For what's right, Jacob answered simply. For once in my life, I'm doing what's right. The statement hung in the air, its simplicity more powerful than any elaborate argument. Several of the riders exchanged uneasy glances. Forced confrontation under cover of darkness was one thing. Violence in broad daylight before witnesses was another matter entirely. Reverend Collins seized the moment. Jeremiah Holt, I've known you 30 years, known your sins and your pride, but murder before witnesses would be a new depth even for you. Nobody's talking murder, Jeremiah protested, though his tone lacked conviction. 8 armed men against a woman and a peaceful rancher, Sarah Wheeler interjected. What would you call it? The balance shifted perceptibly. Deputy Morris lowered the papers in his hand, refusing to meet Jeremiah's eye. One of the hired guns backed his horse a few steps, sensing the changing odds. Jeremiah recognized his diminishing control. This isn't over, Carver. There are other ways to settle accounts. No, there aren't, Abel replied steadily. Not anymore. You come near this ranch, near Lena, near any of us again, I'll have witnesses sign complaints with the territorial marshal. He gestured to those gathered around him. Good people who'll testify to threats, arson, and attempted murder. How long you think you'll keep your land then? The standoff stretched, tension vibrating in the morning air. Finally, Ezekiel Holt reached over and placed his hand on his father's arm. Pa, he said quietly, we should go. Jeremiah stared at his middle son, betrayal flashing across his features. But something in Ezekiel's expression, perhaps fear, perhaps reason, penetrated his anger. The old patriarch looked around once more, calculating his dwindling options. "Samuel," he finally ordered, "we're leaving." Samuel hesitated, pistol still drawn. "But, Pa—" "Now!" Jeremiah's voice cracked like a whip. "This ground's gone sour." With visible reluctance, Samuel holstered his weapon. The group turned their horses, dignity salvaged only by the pretense that leaving was their choice rather than necessity. As they prepared to ride away, Jeremiah fixed his youngest son with a final stare. "Jacob, this is your last chance to remember where you belong." Jacob stood his ground, though his voice softened. "I know exactly where I belong, Pa. Right here, doing what's right." Jeremiah's face hardened into a mask. Without another word, he spurred his horse, leading his diminished party back across the property line. The threat hadn't ended, merely changed form, but the immediate danger had passed. Abel lowered his rifle as they watched the riders disappear. Beside him, Lena released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Their hands found each other, fingers intertwining in a grip both fierce and tender. "They'll be back," she whispered. "Different way, different time." "Maybe," Abel acknowledged, "but not like before, not with everyone knowing. Not with witnesses." Reverend Collins nodded agreement. "Jeremiah Holt's power has always fed on silence. Take that away, and he's just a bitter old man with dwindling influence." Sarah Wheeler stepped forward, practical as always. "We should celebrate with breakfast. I brought provisions enough for everyone." The tension broke with quiet laughter, the simple suggestion of food bringing them back from the precipice of violence to the ordinary rhythms of life. Summer came to the ranch, bringing green to places long barren. Lena's garden flourished against all odds, coaxed from resistant soil through stubborn care. The barn rose again, built by hands both familiar and new, Jacob staying on as ranch hand, Thomas lending his strength on weekends, neighbors appearing with lumber and nails, as if by chance. Word of the confrontation had spread through the county, becoming the stuff of local legend. The Quiet Stand, people called it, the day Jeremiah Holt's reign of intimidation began its slow decline. Not through gunfire or bloodshed, but through community and witness, through people simply refusing to look away. The Holts remained in the territory, but their influence waned. Jacob's defection had cracked the family's united front, and rumors of improper business dealings began to surface now that fear no longer silenced them. Jeremiah grew increasingly isolated. Samuel drank more heavily, and only Ezekiel showed signs of adapting to their changing circumstances. One evening in late August, Abel and Lena sat together on the porch, watching fireflies rise from the meadow grass. Between them on the bench sat a teacup, mended but still bearing the fine lines of its breaking. They passed it back and forth, sharing coffee as the day faded. "Sarah mentioned the schoolteachers leaving," Abel said, breaking a comfortable silence. "Town board's looking for a replacement." Lena smiled slightly, understanding his unspoken suggestion. "Are you trying to be rid of me, Abel Carver?" "Just thinking you might miss teaching." His hand found hers in the gathering darkness. "Wouldn't have to be one or the other. Ranch is close enough to town." She considered this, head tilted in the way he'd come to recognize as her thinking pose. "Perhaps 3 days in town, teaching. Rest here." Her fingers tightened around his. "If my business partner agrees." "He does," Abel replied, voice rough with emotion rarely expressed. They fell silent again, watching darkness settle across land that had transformed from mere property to home. The mended teacup passed between them, no longer a relic of what was lost, but a symbol of what had been found: strength in broken places, healing in shared silence, and the courage to stand quietly for what mattered most. In the distance, Lena's garden bloomed under starlight, seeds of hope planted in soil once thought barren, now yielding their promised harvest.